I'm Michael Warner, and I'm just acting as moderator here. Let me introduce our panel, which is a really wonderful panel. We'll start with Stephen Johnson, who's the editor of the book, and I trust that you all noticed that copies of the book are available right outside. Stephen Johnson, and then to his left is Dana Boyd, and Julian DeBell, and Jack Balkin. These are all stars in the world of new media criticism and commentary, so they probably require very little introduction. And I thought I might begin by just making an observation about the book that we've got here, which is that in some ways, if you look at the title, Best Technology Writing, you might pick it up expecting articles on improvements in automotive design or how to build a nuclear bomb in your dorm room. But in fact, with I think only one exception, all the articles in the book are really about digital media. So the book might as well have been called Best Digital Media Writing of 2009. And I don't think we would have a very different book. So I thought I'd begin by asking Stephen a little bit about how that came about and what he thinks is interesting about that fact.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's just fun to be here. It's funny. I was talking to Julian. We did a Connecticut Public Radio call-in radio show this morning from New York, actually, and Julian made a similar observation that he kind of said, it's interesting. It's really. It's only about digital media. It's not about other forms of technology. And I did have a moment where I thought, wait, there are other forms of technology? I had to kind of go through my head, what are the, oh, right, yeah, I guess there are. So I think there are two reasons. The first is, when you edit something, your own kind of interests and passions inevitably kind of shape a little bit of your selection criteria. But the other thing that I think is worth pointing out is, which is a kind of recurring theme of the whole book, is the speed with which digital media is evolving and the speed with which we are coming up with kind of new uses and integrations for it in our daily lives. And so just on some basic level, I think it's a reasonable statement to say that there's just more activity. And there's more, if you're talking about the kind of social consequences of new technology, there's just more news kind of coming out of digital media and more reasons kind of for reflection. And maybe one of the best examples of it is there's a wonderful piece by Clive Thompson in the essay that he wrote for the Times Magazine that's basically about Facebook and to some extent about Twitter. And it's really about this idea of kind of status updates and ambient awareness, your kind of general, the feeling of I kind of know what my friend had for breakfast, and it's not really news, but it's kind of interesting in a nice way to kind of keep this background kind of following of these people. And you think about it, that was an essay that ran kind of a year and a half ago, and it was a very smart essay, and it had a lot of great observations, and it's still useful, but there was no hint there of Twitter and the Iranian elections at all in the theory of kind of social media there. So you can just see right there the speed with which these things are getting kind of absorbed by us and put to new uses almost immediately. So there's so much to say, I think, about that, whereas, as much as we would like green technology to advance faster, it isn't moving quite as fast, I would say, not being an expert, but saying as an amateur, as the digital media landscape is. And so I think that's one of the reasons why you have that focus in the book.
I said that all these people are big enough stars in a certain world that they probably don't need introductions, but maybe I should introduce them a little anyway. Stephen Johnson, is the author of many best-selling and highly regarded books. The one that I know best is The Ghost Map, because he came and visited the research center that I used to run at Rutgers after The Ghost Map came out. The Ghost Map is a really brilliant study of the cholera epidemic in London in the middle of the 19th century and what it tells us about urbanity and urban life in general. Dana did a dissertation on social computing, is that correct? In social media at Berkeley. And now works between Microsoft and Harvard. Julian is a graduate of Yale, and he was telling me, in fact, that he had 125 with Traugott Lawler, who is teaching 125 this year, in fact. Yes, exactly. We didn't damage him too much. And he's also, as many of you no doubt know, the author of a number of classic articles in the study of the internet, including rape in cyberspace and several others. And Jack Balkin, who teaches in the law school and runs the Balkanization blog, and is a leading scholar and expert and organizer in the area of internet law. So I thought, since a couple of you have English department connections, and since we are in an English department room, I thought I'd ask the question that's dominant on my mind, which is, this book tells us so much about how to think of digital literacy. And it gives us so many reasons for distrusting our ready-made belief that we already know what that is. So Stephen's introduction, which I highly recommend to everybody, it's a really terrific piece explaining the insights of the book. Stephen's introduction begins by observing that when people were writing about the internet 10 years ago, it was all future-oriented. It was all predictive. What's going to happen to the world now being organized by hypertext? And it turns out that most of the predictions were wrong. Most of the essays in this book, he observes, are about just describing the complexity of present-day uses of the internet. So there's no hyperventilating about the future. There's just an attempt to try to be faithful to the extraordinary range and complexity of what people are actually doing. So we seem to, in some ways, to have lost or given up on the apparent clarity of a concept like digital literacy, as though we know what that means, but we're getting much more detailed understanding of how these media are shaping up in actual practice and the kinds of social worlds that people are building out of them.
Well, I'll just say one thing to start, and then I'll let the others talk. But I think one of the clearest examples of that is there's an essay we put in there by Nicholas Carr called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And it's a very smart and engaging essay. I disagree with a bunch of it, but it was one of those essays you kind of enjoy and you learn from disagreeing with it. And it was a kind of a healthy contribution, I think, to the debate on a couple of fronts. And what Nick was saying in this piece is that he can feel when he sits down to read a book, the old-fashioned kind, without a screen attached to it, that he can feel this kind of lateral pull of kind of hypertext and Gmail and Twitter and all these things that he knows is sitting there across the room on the screen, and he can feel his brain having kind of acclimated to the life on the screen, being unable to kind of focus in the same way and to get into that kind of immersive, kind of linear focus that traditional reading was supposed to be about. And so he kind of builds this argument about kind of the Google landscape kind of dumbing us down. And I think, on the one hand, I feel that too. And the irony of it is, you said that our predictions about this stuff, when I was sitting around thinking about what hypertext was going to be like in the early 90s, I went to Brown as an undergrad, and we were doing a lot of kind of innovative work back then. Dana went to Brown as well, in hypertext fiction. And before the web came around, it's hard to remember this now, but 98% of the innovation in hypertext was experimental fiction authors or poetry authors who were talking about how this was going to revolutionize narrative, and you would read narrative in this nonlinear way, and you'd choose one path or another, and you'd construct hopscotch style your stories out of these hypertext branching paths. And it turned out that hypertext became vastly more mainstream than anybody ever dreamed. Even the most over-the-top advocates for it never thought that my 96-year-old grandmother would be clicking on links the way she does every day now. But nonlinear narrative storytelling turned out to have nothing to do with the success of hypertext. And it remains basically as marginal and experimental as it was then. I hope I'm not insulting anybody in the audience, but it has not. We still sit there and read Dan Brown novels one page after the other. But hypertext went mainstream in all these other ways. And so the irony of it is that it turns out then, once you're in the kind of present tense of these media forms going fully mainstream and getting integrated into the culture, that all these unpredictable things happen. And then part of your work as a critic and as a writer is not to project forward into the future, but rather to just watch yourself or to watch people around you as these new forms become kind of mainstream. And what ended up happening, I think, that you can see in the case of Nick's essay and with Google, it's not that our books became nonlinear, but that when we sit down to read them now, we feel this kind of weird withdrawal from our normal nonlinear experience moving around the web. And so we miss the links. It's not that there are links there, it's just that we wish they were there on some level. And that means, I think, finally, to kind of sum it up, is that it's true, I think, what Nick says. It's a trade-off, though, and it's a trade-off that I think a lot of us have kind of willingly made, that we understand that it's harder to read 400 consecutive pages than it was when I was in grad school, say, before the web came along. On the other hand, there's so much that you get out of the immersion in these things, in these new forms, that despite all the overload and despite all the distractions, we're willing to kind of make that trade-off because of all the benefits.
I would take a slightly different tactic, and I would say, over and over again since the beginning of all of this, we've enjoyed adding digital or or cyber to a whole variety of things we thought we understood. And the result of which is we get obsessed with the technology, right? So digital literacy is all about the technology. When in fact what we're seeing is that we have to complicate, what the digital does is it complicates our understanding of, say, literacy in this case. And the same things that are starting to apply are the kinds of thinking that we have to do for things like literacy, what we have to do because of the digital actually apply back. And so what ends up happening is we have this move that happens where first it's all about the digital, and slowly the digital fades away. And so when I think about your question about digital literacy, I think that the most sort of salient aspect of it is what's happening to literacy. How do we think about literacy, and what is this shift in technology and the introduction of all of these new media do to our basic understandings of literacy? And I think we're certainly seeing that in the classroom in a really interesting way, which is, of course, everyone wants to introduce media literacy into the classroom and digital literacy in the classroom. And at first they mean like familiarity with technology. But all of a sudden you see that we actually are having, what does it mean to have a source? What kind of bias is baked into whatever we're reading or consuming? How do we think about the politics and the elements that come together to make this piece of content? And so all of a sudden it becomes a question not of digital, but of literacy at its core. And so I think that there's a really fascinating move, which I think ends up weaving its way through this whole book, where it's a book about, in some ways, digital technologies, but in many, or digital media, but it's really a book about media and a whole variety of different things. And we've gotten past our obsession with the new, and are sort of taking really core things and looking at some of the shifts and the changes, but also at a core question for each one of these essays of just sort of what does everyday life look like now?
So I have the pleasure to announce that I will be filling Stephen's shoes next year with the Best of Technology Writing of 2010. I'm going to be editing the next year's collection. And as I was reading through Stephen's introductory essay, I was thinking, well, damn, that's a hard act to follow, because it's laid out the issues around digital media and how it's shaping intellectual discourse and thought itself so well. And then the next essay suddenly presented itself in the form of the question Michael precisely asked. Why is there no other technology being discussed? There actually, believe it or not, there are a couple of essays in here about green technology, about architectural technology, that sort of get elided. And for all of the reasons that Stephen suggests, there's just so much happening in digital media that makes for so many stories and makes for such a kinetic landscape. But the question still needs asking. Why digital technology? Why not the other stuff? Why bits and not atoms, right? And it's not as if these are just two different stories and we're deciding to tell the digital media story. They're actually two sides of the same story. It's interesting, on the call-in show today, there was a caller, and you know how it is with a call-in show. You never know what the level of insight is going to be. But somebody managed to get in the interesting point that, the amount of coal that's being burned to service all of this literate experimentation is really quite phenomenal. The two questions are linked. I came across a great quote the other day from a theorist of peer-to-peer production named Michel Bauwens, who said, we're living at this moment in this world in a political economy that has it exactly backwards, right? We think that the production of the natural world is completely unlimited, completely limitless and infinite, and we think that we should be introducing artificial scarcities into the world of immaterial production, as we see with the whole battle around intellectual property online. The two stories are intimately related, and maybe we're not looking at that story of, how do we develop technology that will save the world from the impending apocalypse, because it's just an unpleasant story to look at. I mean, it's really there's quite a lot of heavy lifting there, and it's not as much fun as Twitter, God knows. But I think, I just also finally want to say, I think there's also a little bit of a professional bias here. We are writers, and, this is writing about tech. And I have always taken it for obvious, to the point where maybe it's not even a useful observation, but it might be in this context, that really the first digital technology was writing itself. I mean, if you think about how writing represents reality, it is the assigning of arbitrary signals to represent, what is out there in reality, as opposed to the analog representation, which is a closer, more physical, immediate, supposedly, representation. It's just a different style of representation, and inherited from language itself, but that's, a whole other topic. So I think we as writers are drawn to digital technology because it has so many of the crazy features of writing, but on steroids. I mean, it is really, so this goes to the debate between Nicholas and Stephen, which is very interesting and has good points on both sides, but on both sides kind of assumes that we really are talking about a completely new era. When in fact this is a phase shift in a very long evolution of digital technology, beginning with writing. There are moments in Nicholas's piece where he'll sort of say, as if analogizing to the present moment, well, when writing came along, Plato and Socrates were very suspicious of it, and because it had all these problems that people were going to outsource their memory and they were going to lose their minds, in various ways. Well, now we've seen that it was a worthwhile trade-off, but we don't know about this one. Well, the assumption there is that, that gamble was made, and the results are clear, and, and when printing came along, that was a similar moment, and now we know what happened. But in fact, we still don't know what happened, because this is all still the fallout from the invention of writing itself. It's taken to a new level, but it's just another chapter in the same story.
I think actually something about digital and something about others. So digital. One thing I'm the director of a center here at Yale, which some of you may know of, and some of you are members of, I see in the audience, called the Information Society Project, and it's been around here since 1997, and it studies law and new technologies and their effects on society. We started in 1997, and we had to figure out what to call it. At Harvard, they called their center the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. Notice the focus on internet and society. I like the society part. At Stanford, they called their center the Center for Law and Technology. Law, technology. At Michigan State, I think it was the Center for Law and Intellectual Property. Right? And so so when I started the center, I said I will call it the Information Society Project. Why? Because this goes back to the question of technology. It was my bet or my imagination that the central questions that I wanted to address were questions of sociality on the first part and power on the second. And flows of information flows, and how information moves from person to person, and how people know things and move their knowledge to other people. These things were centrally related to notions of society, sociality, and power, politics. It actually turns out, this is a good bet, it actually turned out that way. That when people talk about law and technology now, they're focused on the ideas of information flows, knowledge flows, and the forms of power and sociality that come with them. But there are lots of other kinds of technology, right? Your car, you want a hybrid car. It's about power too, but in some sense it's not about information flows or knowledge flows. It's not about access to knowledge. And that's the reason why it took off generally, because people were naturally attracted to thinking about things that had to do with society and relations in society and power in society. And that's why it makes perfect sense that the best technology right in 2009 would be precisely about those questions. Literacy. Let me see a little bit about literacy. One of the things you learn when you study technology is the first thing that people tell you is, oh, there's nothing new. Nothing new here. And then after having told you there's nothing new, then they ignore you and they don't pay any attention to anything else you have to say. And the key thing that you have to focus on with people when you talk about technology is to get them to understand that what you're not interested in is what's new. You're interested in what becomes newly salient. What features of the human condition suddenly are put in the foreground in ways you hadn't thought before because you changed the technological assumptions. So for example, let's take the question of literacy. Literacy was always based on an economy between having skills and the need to learn new skills. You had skills, you did what you want, you had new skills, and they gave you certain kinds of power and ability. And there was always a choice. Do I want to adopt new skills, or am I fine with the skills I have? Similarly, literacy was also involved in economy of attention, which is how much can I digest, how much can I think about, what do I do, how do I spend my time? And it was also an economy of time, right? I only have a limited amount of time a day, what can I do? It was also a notion of your own power as a person and your ability to relate to others. That was also a kind of economy. What did the technology do? Did the technology change the fact that we had to worry about these different economies? No, it didn't change it at all. Still parts of the human condition. All it did was change the balance of your adjustment of judgment when you involve in these economies. So now, when all you got is a book and nothing else, well, basically it makes sense to economize in focusing on that book. But when you have different kinds of possibilities, then your judgments of economy will be different. I use this term economy in two different senses, both in the very narrow economic sense of costs and benefits, and in the larger sense of a system, a social system of relations in which you get bound to other people by your choice of what to spend time on, by how people have power in relationship to you, the choices you make about how you want to live your life. And what technology does is it disrupts the existing economies of attention, of knowledge, of formation of human capital and sociality.
That's beautiful, and I wonder if we can follow up on a couple of the strands you just laid out for us. From the side of those of us who study old-fashioned codex literacies, it's lately been argued that literacy, in the sense of print literacy, is a bad abstraction of many of the questions you just referred to. For example, in the colonial period of American history, women were routinely taught to read but not to write. So the idea of literacy as a single skill is the first mistake we make about it. The second mistake we make about it is the overloading of that skill concept with all kinds of other assumptions about right subjectivity, being the right kind of person, the kind of person necessary to run a democracy, for example. So Chris Hedges, the guy who wrote War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, has a new book called Empire of Illusion, all about the loss of the extinction of print literacy, and it's a kind of apocalyptic vision of what's going to happen now that people aren't always reading, as Stephen puts it, the hallowed 400-page novel. But now I think we can see that literacy might always have been, our idea of literacy might always have been, to some degree, the ideology of the clerical class. And so we now have to go back and tease out all the different things that literacy has come to mean and talk about why.